Take a dollar bill out of your pocket. Look at the line printed just above Washington's portrait. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That's it. That's the whole promise. It's tender because the government says it's tender, and because you and everyone around you agree to behave as if that's enough. It didn't always say that. For the first 179 years of American history, a dollar wasn't a promise. It was a receipt, a specific, legally defined weight of metal that somebody, somewhere, owed you. The dollar wasn't valuable because Washington's face was printed on it. It was valuable because a vault was standing behind it. And then, on a Sunday night in August of 1971, in a single televised speech that interrupted a Western on NBC, that link was cut. Not by a war, not by a market crash, by 15 men at a mountain retreat in Maryland over a single weekend in total secrecy, with the president's own Federal Reserve chairman sitting there begging him not to do it. So, how did a country come to define its money as a lump of metal in the first place? How did the entire world end up storing its savings in American dollars? Why did a French president start demanding his gold back by the shipload? What actually happened at Camp David that weekend? And why does one small word in Nixon's speech, a word almost nobody noticed at the time, turn out to be the most important word in the whole story? Because what happened that night rewired the relationship between money and value for every person on Earth permanently, including you. The road there runs through a New Hampshire hotel that wasn't ready for its guests, a dying British genius, a run on the Bank of England so heavy that people worried about the floor, and a Texan who told Europe its money problems weren't his. So, let me take you back to the beginning. To understand what got cut that night, you have to go back to a room in Philadelphia in the spring of 1792. On April 2nd of that year, Congress passed the Coinage Act, and here's the thing most people don't realize about it. Congress didn't just invent a currency and give it a name. It defined the dollar the way you'd define a kilogram or a mile. The dollar, the law said, was 371 1/4 grains of pure silver. A grain is a unit of weight, roughly 65 milligrams, originally based on the weight of a single seed of barley. Gold was folded into the same system at a fixed ratio, with the $10 gold eagle set at 247 1/2 grains of pure gold. Think about that for a second. The dollar wasn't a thing the government issued. It was a measurement. Saying something cost $1 was like saying a board was 6 feet long, and Congress was deadly serious about protecting that definition. Buried in Section 19 of that same act is a provision stating that any officer of the mint who debased the coinage, who quietly mixed in cheaper metal and pocketed the difference, would suffer death. Not a fine, not prison, death. That's how frightened the founding generation was of a government that could water down its own money. You can see why. They just lived through it. During the Revolution, the Continental Congress had printed paper money in enormous quantities to pay for the war, and that paper had collapsed so completely that not worth a continental became an American insult that survived for over a century. They'd watched paper money fail in real time in their own pockets. Metal was the answer to that trauma. There's a lovely story attached to those first coins, by the way. Tradition holds that George Washington donated his own household silver to be melted down and struck into the very first half dimes. It's a great story. It's also a tradition rather than a documented fact, so treat it as folklore rather than history. But the logic underneath the metal is what matters, and it fits in one sentence. A politician can print paper. A politician cannot print gold. That was the whole appeal. Under a gold standard, the value of your savings isn't a decision anybody makes. It's a fact, set by geology and mining output, and there is nothing a Treasury Secretary can do about it on a Tuesday afternoon, which sounds wonderful until you're on the wrong side of it. Because a money supply tied to how much metal comes out of the ground is supply that grows slowly. And if the economy grows faster than the gold supply, prices fall. That's deflation, and it sounds pleasant until you owe somebody money. If you're a Kansas wheat farmer in the 1880s with a mortgage fixed in dollars, and the price of wheat keeps dropping year after year, your debt doesn't shrink with it. Every harvest buys back fewer dollars. The loan gets heavier while your crop gets cheaper. You are being slowly crushed by a system that bankers keep telling you is neutral and natural. That anger produced one of the most electrifying speeches in American political history. Chicago, July 9, 1896, the Democratic National Convention. William Jennings Bryan, 36 years old, walks to the podium and delivers what became known as the Cross of Gold speech, ending with the image of mankind being crucified upon a cross of gold. The hall reportedly went berserk. Men threw hats and coats in the air. Delegates carried him on their shoulders. He won the nomination the next day. He also lost the election. And in 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, formally putting the country on gold alone. The bankers won that round. Hold on to Bryan, though, because his argument never actually died. it just changed clothes. The first real break came in 1933, and it came from inside the house. Franklin Roosevelt took office in March of that year with the banking system in free fall. People were pulling money out of banks and converting it into gold coin, which they were then stuffing into mattresses and safe deposit boxes, which meant the banks had less gold, which made everyone want to pull their money out faster. A death spiral. So, on April 5, 1933, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. It required Americans to hand in their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank by the 1st of May, in exchange for paper dollars at the official rate of $20.67 an ounce. Imagine you're a shopkeeper in Cleveland that spring. You've got 4 gold double eagles in a drawer saved over 15 years. There is now a federal order telling you to carry them to a bank and swap them for paper. And the penalty for keeping them is a fine of up to $10,000, or up to 10 years in prison, or both. $10,000 in 1933 was not a parking ticket. It was more than the price of a good house, several times the annual salary of most working Americans, and something on the order of $250,000 in today's money. Most people complied. One who didn't was a New York attorney named Frederick Barber Campbell, who had thousands of ounces on deposit at Chase and went to court when the bank wouldn't hand it over. He was indicted, and his case became one of the early legal tests of the whole policy. And then came the part that stung. On January 30th, 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, and the government revalued gold from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce. Overnight by decree, the dollar was worth about 41% less in gold. If you had obeyed the order, you'd been paid at the old price, and then watched the metal you handed over get repriced upward a few months later, with the profit landing in the Treasury. Now, the sober correction, because this is where a lot of retailings go off the rails. This wasn't theft dressed up as policy so much as a deliberate, openly debated attempt to reflate a collapsing economy, and there's serious scholarship arguing it worked. The economist Christina Romer has argued that the monetary expansion flowing from that gold revaluation was the single most important driver of the recovery from the Great Depression. You can think it was justified. You can think it was an outrage. Plenty of thoughtful people have landed on each side, but there's one detail to file away because we're going to come back to it. From 1933 onward, it was illegal for an ordinary American to own monetary gold. Remember that. It matters later. So, by the mid-1930s, the dollar was still tied to gold, but only for governments and foreign central banks. For you, the citizen, the link was already gone, and that's the arrangement that walked into the room when the world sat down to rebuild itself. July 1944. The war isn't over. Allied are still fighting in Normandy. And 730 delegates from 44 nations arrive at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a grand old resort in the mountains that had been sitting half-shuttered and was frantically reopened for the occasion. Delegates reported shortages of rooms, staff, and hot water. Some slept in hallways. The bar, by all accounts, did excellent business. 2 men dominated that hotel. The first was John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive, leading the British delegation and visibly unwell. His heart was failing. He would be dead within 2 years. Keynes wanted something genuinely radical, a neutral international currency he called Bancor, issued by a global clearing institution belonging to no single country. The second was Harry Dexter White, a senior official at the United States Treasury, and the man who actually held the cards, because America at that point held roughly 2/3 of all the official gold on the planet. White's plan won. It usually does when your side has the gold. Here's what they built in plain English. The United States would keep the dollar convertible into gold at $35 an ounce, but only for foreign governments and central banks, not for individuals. Every other country would then peg its own currency to the dollar within a narrow band. So, the Italian lira was tied to the dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold, and therefore, every currency on earth was tied to gold through New York. It was elegant. It gave the world stable exchange rates, which meant businesses could sign contracts across borders without gambling on currency swings. It created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to referee the whole thing. And it quietly handed the United States something no country had ever had, because when the world agrees to hold its savings in your currency, you can pay your foreign bills by printing paper that foreigners then keep rather than spend. A French finance minister would later call this an exorbitant privilege, and the phrase stuck because it was exactly right. One more note about the architect, because it belongs in the record. Harry Dexter White was later accused of having passed information to Soviet intelligence. He testified before Congress in August 1948, denied everything, and died of a heart attack 3 days later. Decrypted Soviet cables released decades afterwards strengthened the case against him, and historians still argue about the extent of what he did. It's a strange, uncomfortable footnote to the founding of the modern financial system, and it's true. And for about 15 years, the system worked better than anyone in that hotel hoped. Europe rebuilt, Japan rebuilt, trade exploded, the dollar became the currency of the world backed by a mountain of gold in Kentucky and Manhattan. But the flaw was in the blueprint from day one, and in 1960, a Belgian economist stood up in front of Congress and explained exactly how the whole thing would end. His name was Robert Triffin, and the problem he identified is now named after him. Here's the dilemma, stripped of jargon. The world was growing, and world trade runs on dollars, so the world needed more and more dollars. The only way to get them was for the United States to send more dollars abroad than it took back in year after year. But every dollar sitting in a foreign bank was a claim on American gold. So the more dollars the world got, the more claims piled up against a gold pile that wasn't growing. Do it, and you eventually can't pay. Stop doing it, and you strangle world trade. That's the trap. There was no version of the system where America wins in the long run. Triffin laid it out in his 1960 book and in testimony on Capitol Hill, and the answer he got was essentially a polite nod. Remember his name. We'll come back to him at the very end, because the numbers were already moving. At its peak in the late 1940s, the United States held somewhere near 20,000 metric tons of gold. To put that in something you can picture, that's a solid cube of metal about 70 feet on a side, and it was roughly 2/3 of all the official gold in the world sitting inside one country. By 1958, Europe had recovered enough to make its currencies freely convertible again, and the flow reversed. Dollars that had gone out to rebuild the world started coming home, asking to be turned into metal. And here's the detail most people overlook about the years that followed. Officially, the gold price was fixed at $35. In reality, it was being held there by hand. In October 1960, during the final weeks of the Kennedy-Nixon campaign, the price of gold on the London market broke past $40 an ounce, as traders bet that whoever won would devalue. Kennedy had to publicly promise he wouldn't, and then, in 1961, 8 central banks quietly formed what was called the London Gold Pool, an arrangement where they would sell their own gold into the market whenever the price rose and buy it back when it fell to keep that $35 figure looking natural. Picture that, the most fundamental price in the global economy, the one every textbook described as fixed, was being manually pinned in place by committee, with real bullion flown across the Atlantic to hold the line. It held for 7 years. Then, France walked in. On February 4th, 1965, Charles de Gaulle, DGOHL, held a press conference in the ballroom of the Élysée Palace, in front of a room packed with journalists, and did something no head of state had done. He attacked the dollar directly. He argued that the international system should return to a genuine gold standard in which no single country got the privilege of paying its debts with its own printed paper. Behind that speech was an economist named Jacques Rueff, de Gaulle's advisor, who had been making the argument for years that the dollar system let America run deficits forever, and that this was a form of soft imperialism dressed as cooperation. And France didn't just talk, it began systematically converting its dollar reserves into gold month after month. Now, here's where you have to be careful, because this is the point in the story where the dramatic version usually takes over. You'll hear that de Gaulle sent the French Navy across the Atlantic to haul the bullion home, warships steaming into New York Harbor. It's a fantastic image. It's also mostly not how it worked. The overwhelming majority of these transfers were done by ledger entry 80 feet below Liberty Street in Manhattan, in the vault of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which sits on the bedrock of the island because nothing else would hold the weight. Men in steel-capped boots moved bars on trolleys from one numbered compartment to another. The gold didn't leave the building. It changed cages. France did physically repatriate significant quantities over these years, but the shipload of warships version is theatrical embroidery on a real and quite deliberate policy. Whichever way it traveled, the effect was the same. The pile was shrinking, and other countries were watching France do it and doing the arithmetic. Meanwhile, America was spending. The war in Vietnam was escalating, and the Great Society programs were expanding at the same time, guns and butter together, and Washington chose not to raise taxes enough to cover both. The gap was filled with dollars, and that's when the whole thing started to come apart in public. In November 1967, Britain devalued the pound, which shook confidence in every paper currency. Then in January 1968 came the Tet Offensive, which convinced a lot of the world that the Vietnam War was going to be far longer and far more expensive than advertised. Money ran for cover, and cover meant gold. March 1968 was the panic. Buyers hit the London market so hard that the gold pool was hemorrhaging metal by the hundreds of tons. American planes flew bullion across the Atlantic to feed the market. There are accounts from inside the Bank of England of so much gold moving through the building that staff worried about the load-bearing capacity of the floors. On March 15, 1968, at the request of the United States, the British government closed the London gold market outright, declaring a bank holiday. 2 days later in Washington, the central banks gave up and created a two-tier system, one official price of $35 for transactions between governments and one free market price for everyone else, which they would no longer try to control. Read that again, because it's the moment the pretense broke. There were now two prices for gold. The official one was a fiction maintained for accounting purposes, and everyone in the room knew it, which brings us to Richard Nixon, who inherited this in January 1969, along with an inflation problem, a recession, and an election coming in 1972. By the summer of 1971, the arithmetic was brutal. The United States held gold worth roughly $10 billion at the official price. Foreign governments and banks held dollar claims of more than $40 billion. So, the World's Bank had about a quarter of the cash it would need if everyone showed up at once, and people started showing up. In May 1971, so much money flooded into Germany that the Bundesbank gave up defending its exchange rate and let the mark float. Reports at the time described roughly $1 billion pouring in during the first 40 minutes of trading on a single morning. Switzerland converted dollars into gold. France converted dollars into gold. On August 6th, the Congressional Subcommittee published a report saying plainly that the dollar was overvalued and the run accelerated into something close to a stampede. Then, in the second week of August, word reached the Treasury that the British had come asking for cover on billions of dollars, a figure usually put at around $3 billion, though accounts differ on exactly what was requested. Britain, the closest ally America had, Paul Volcker, the Treasury Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs, had been quietly drafting contingency plans for exactly this scenario for 2 years. He now had to go recommend using them. On Friday, August 13, 1971, 15 men were summoned to Camp David. The secrecy was extraordinary. Participants were told not to inform their families where they were going. Phone use was restricted. Nobody outside the mountain was to know a meeting was happening at all, because a leak would have triggered a global run over the weekend. They gathered in the lodge, and John Connally, the Treasury Secretary, laid out the plan. Close the gold window, impose a tax on imports, and freeze wages and prices at home. Connally was a Texan, a former governor, a man who had been in the car in Dallas in 1963 and taken a bullet through the chest. He was not an economist and never pretended to be. What he had was a politician's instinct for who gets blamed. His position was simple. America should act first, act unilaterally, act big, and let everyone else adjust afterward. And that's when Arthur Burns, the chairman Federal Reserve, pushed back. Burns was a pipe-smoking academic, a man Nixon had appointed himself, and he was genuinely alarmed. He argued that the window could still be held, that the situation was manageable, that the crisis was being overstated. He warned that severing the dollar's last tie to gold would be read around the world as an American default, a signal that the United States could not keep its word. According to William Safire, the speechwriter who was in the room and later wrote about it, Burns warned that Soviet propaganda would trumpet the collapse of capitalism. Connally's answer was essentially, so what? If we don't act, the decision gets made for us next week by a foreign central bank. The two of them went back and forth in front of the president for the better part of 2 days. Volcker, the technician, sat in the middle of it, believing the action was unavoidable and hating it anyway. He had spent his career defending the fixed-rate system, and now he was going to help dismantle it. Nixon listened, and by Saturday he had decided, which left one problem. How do you explain to the American public that the money in their pocket has just changed its nature? They wrote through Saturday night. Safire drafted. The economists argued over wording, and Nixon rewrote passages himself in the small hours. The final decision was made to go on television the following evening before Tokyo and then Europe opened for the week. There would be no consultation with allies, no advance notice to the IMF, no warning to Congress. 15 men on a mountain, and then a broadcast. At 9 o'clock Eastern Time on Sunday, August 15, 1971, NBC interrupted an episode of Bonanza. Roughly a third of the country was watching television that night, and Nixon spoke for about 18 minutes. He didn't lead with gold, he led with jobs and prices and the strength of the American worker. He announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices, the first peacetime wage and price controls in American history. He announced a 10% surcharge on imported goods, which was in effect a tariff on the whole world at once. Both of those were designed to be popular, and both of those were what most of the audience remembered the next morning. And in the middle of it came the sentence that ended era. He said he had directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporarily, that's the word, that's the one to watch. It was not a slip and it was not a lie exactly. Everyone involved genuinely expected to negotiate a new fixed system within months, with a new gold price once the pressure was off. 55 years later, the window is still closed. Nothing in modern economic history has been temporary for quite so long. Here's the part that surprised almost everyone. The public loved it. The switchboard lit up with support. And on Monday, August 16th, instead of collapsing, the stock market posted what was then its largest one-day point gain in history, with the Dow rising nearly 33 points, close to 4% on record volume. The president had appeared decisive. Americans were told the country had stopped letting foreigners push it around, and they liked being told that. Abroad, the reaction was rather different. Japan's markets, caught unprepared, absorbed an enormous flood of dollars before Tokyo finally gave up defending its exchange rate. European finance ministers were furious at having learned about it from television. When they confronted Connally at a meeting in Rome that November, he gave them a line that has been quoted in every history of the period since. "The dollar," he said, "is our currency, but it's your problem." He was not being subtle. He was describing the actual power relationship out loud, which is why the line stung. For a moment, it looked like the system might be patched. In December 1971, negotiators met at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and agreed to a realignment. The dollar would be devalued, gold repriced from $35 to $38 an ounce, and the fixed-rate world would carry on with new numbers. Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted about 15 months because the underlying problem hadn't been fixed at all. The dollar was still overvalued, America was still running deficits, and speculators simply resumed betting against the new numbers. A second devaluation came in February 1973. By March, the major currencies had given up and begun to float freely against one another, their values set minute by traders rather than by treaties. That's the world you live in now. It started that spring. And in 1974, a quiet piece of legislation closed the loop we opened earlier. Effective December 31st of that year, Americans could legally own gold again for the first time since 1933. 41 years. An entire working lifetime during which the metal that officially backed your currency was something you were not permitted to hold. The consequences nobody at Camp David priced in arrived fast. When the dollar's value dropped, oil producers, who sold their oil for dollars, saw their real income falling. That grievance was part of the backdrop to the price shocks of 1973 and 1974, when oil quadrupled. Inflation in the United States, which had been running around 4% in 1971, hit double digits by 1974, fell back, and then returned worse, over 13% in 1979, peaking near 15% in March of 1980. Gold, freed from its official price, climbed from $35 an ounce to $850 in January 1980. And the man who finally broke that inflation was Paul Volcker, the same Volcker who had sat in the lodge at Camp David. He became Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979 and pushed interest rates to nearly 20%, which crushed prices by crushing the economy. Unemployment reached 10.8% in late 1982, the highest since the Depression. Farmers drove tractors to Washington to protest. Home builders mailed him bricks. So who was right? Both of them partly, which is the honest answer. Arthur Burns was right, that cutting the last tie to gold would remove a discipline on inflation, and the decade that followed proved it in the most painful way available. But Burns was wrong that the system could have been saved. By August 1971, the promise was arithmetically unpayable. $10 billion in gold does not cover $40 billion in claims, and no amount of diplomacy changes that. Nixon didn't end the gold standard so much as formally acknowledge that it had already ended, and nobody had said so out loud. When you zoom out and look at the whole arc, from that Philadelphia Mint in 1792 to a lodge in Maryland in 1971, this isn't really a story about metal at all. It's a single argument running for 179 years over one question. Should the value of your money be a fact or a decision? Under gold, it was closer to a fact. Nobody could vote to make your savings worth less. That was the appeal, and it was real, but it was also brutal, because when the economy needed more money and the mines didn't produce it, the adjustment came out of wages, farms, and jobs. That's what Bryan was shouting about in 1896, and he wasn't wrong either. Since 1971, it's been a decision. A committee meets, votes, and the value of everything you own shifts slightly. Your mortgage rate, your rent, the interest on your savings, the price of your groceries, all of it now runs downstream of a room full of people making a judgment call. $1 from 1971 buys roughly what $1/8 of a dollar buys today. But here's the other half of that ledger, and it deserves equal weight. Over those same decades, the American economy grew into the largest in history. The world voluntarily piled into dollars rather than fleeing them. And central banks got the tool that let them fight the 2008 crisis and the 2020 shutdown without letting the whole system freeze solid. Under a strict gold standard, neither rescue would have been possible. Whether that trade was worth it depends entirely on what you value, and a saver and a borrower will never give you the same answer. And remember Robert Triffin, the economist nobody listened to in 1960. His dilemma didn't go away in 1971. It just took off the gold costume. The world still needs dollars. America still supplies them by running deficits, and everyone still quietly wonders how long the arrangement can last. The trap he described is still the trap. We just stopped pretending there's metal at the bottom of it, which leaves the question that was never really about gold in the first place. Not what is money backed by, but who decides what your money is worth, and in whose interest do they decide it? In 1792, the answer was written into law as a weight of silver. In 1971, the answer became 15 men on a mountain over a weekend in secret. Today, it's a committee that meets 8 times a year, and if you're honest, you probably don't know most of their names. If this changed how you see the money in your pocket, subscribe. We go deep on the hidden systems that shape your world, the mechanisms of power that were built in rooms you were never invited into, and that quietly set the terms of your ordinary life. If that's the kind of thinking you want more of, you're in the right place. And if you want to keep pulling on this thread, there's a next video coming that you won't want to miss, because the bigger break in the story didn't happen in 1971 at all. It happened in 1933.